spooky place.
Do you believe in things that go bump in the night? What if I told you that the story you're about to hear is real, and the nightmare it describes is closer than you think? Brace yourself, because after this, you won't be sleeping well tonight. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. The whispers in the cornfield. Every Halloween, the air around the Miller farm grew heavy, as if the very earth itself held its breath. The cornfield behind the farm, once golden and bountiful, now stood tall and skeletal, its stalks brittle and blackened as though scorched by some unseen fire. The locals called it the Whispering Field, and they spoke of it in hushed tones, warning their children to stay far away. They said the field was cursed, haunted by the souls of children who had vanished decades ago, children who had dared to enter the corn on Halloween night and were never seen again. But legends, no matter how dark, have a way of tempting the foolish. And so, on a cold October night, a group of 5 teenagers, Ethan, Claire, Marcus, Jenna, and Tyler, gathered at the edge of the field, their breath visible in the moonlight. They had come on a dare, armed with flashlights, a flask of cheap whiskey, and the invincibility of youth. They laughed as they crossed the threshold into the corn, their voices loud and brash, as if to drown out the unease that gnawed at the edges of their bravado. The field was eerily silent at first, the only sound the crunch of their footsteps on the dry earth. But as the moon climbed higher, the whispers began. Soft at first, like the rustle of leaves, they grew louder, more distinct. Giggles, childlike and innocent, drifted through the stalks, though there was no one in sight. The teenagers froze, their laughter dying in their throats. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "It's just the wind," Ethan said, though his knuckles were wide around his flashlight. "Keep moving." But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to come from all directions. The stalks around them swayed, though there was no breeze. The giggles turned to murmurs, then to voices, voices that called their names. "Ethan, Claire, Marcus." Tyler spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The response was a low, guttural laugh that sent shivers down their spines. The corn seemed to close in around them, the stalks pressing closer, tighter. Jenna screamed as something brushed against her arm, cold and clammy. But when she turned, there was nothing there. "Let's get out of here," Marcus shouted, his voice high with panic. They ran, their flashlights bouncing wildly, but the field seemed endless. No matter which way they turned, they only found more corn, more darkness. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the giggles turned to screams, screams that echoed with a terrible familiarity, as if they had been trapped in the field for decades. One by one, they began to disappear. Claire was the first. She had been running just ahead of Ethan when she suddenly stopped, her body rigid. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Before Ethan could respond, she was yanked into the stalks, her scream cut short. Marcus vanished next. He had been lagging behind, muttering prayers under his breath, when the corn seemed to swallow him whole. His flashlight fell to the ground, its beam flickering before going out. Jenna and Tyler clung to each other, their faces pale with fear. "We're going to die here," Jenna sobbed. Tyler tried to reassure her, but his words were drowned out by a sudden, deafening roar. The ground beneath them trembled, and the corn parted to reveal a figure, a tall, shadowy shape with glowing red eyes. It reached for them, its fingers long and clawed, and they screamed as it dragged them into the darkness. Ethan was alone now, his heart pounding in his chest. He stumbled through the field, his flashlight barely piercing the suffocating blackness. The whispers were deafening, the voices overlapping, calling his name over and over. He fell to his knees, clutching his ears, tears streaming down his face. "Please," he begged, "let me go." The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then a single voice spoke, soft and sweet like a child's. "Join us, Ethan." He looked up and saw them. Dozens of children, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow. They reached for him, their fingers cold and lifeless. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came out. The children surrounded him, their whispers filling his mind, and he felt himself being pulled into the earth, into the darkness. When the sun rose the next morning, the cornfield was silent once more. The locals found the teenagers' belongings scattered at the edge of the field: flashlights, a flask, a single sneaker. But of the teenagers themselves, there was no trace. And so, the legend of the Whispering Field grew. Every Halloween, the air grows heavy, and the whispers return, calling to the foolish, the brave, the curious. And every year, more souls are added to the field, their voices joining the chorus of the lost. But if you listen closely on a quiet October night, you might hear something else, a soft, desperate plea, barely audible beneath the whispers. It's the voice of Ethan, or Claire, or Marcus, or any of the others who dared to enter the field. They're still there, trapped in the corn, begging for someone to save them. But no one ever does. The disappearance of the 5 teenagers became the talk of the town, but not for long. The locals, hardened by decades of fear, quickly buried the incident under a veil of silence. The Miller farm was abandoned, its fields left to rot, and the cornfield became a forbidden place, a cursed scar on the landscape. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, as if the field itself was hungry for more. A year passed, and Halloween came again. This time, the whispers reached beyond the town, carried on the wind like a siren's call. They found their way to a group of urban explorers, thrill seekers who scoured the internet for haunted places to film. Among them was Rachel, a fearless skeptic who didn't believe in ghosts, only in ratings. Her team, Liam, a cameraman, Priya, a sound technician, and Kyle, a self-proclaimed paranormal expert, arrived at the Miller farm just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The field loomed before them, its stalks black and twisted, like the fingers of a giant clawing at the sky. Rachel grinned, holding up her camera. "This is it, guys. The infamous Whispering Field. Let's see if it lives up to the hype." They set up their equipment at the edge of the field, the red light of the camera blinking like an unblinking eye. As darkness fell, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. The team exchanged uneasy glances. "That's not the wind," Kyle muttered, clutching his EMF detector. The needle was spinning wildly. "Keep rolling," Rachel said, her voice steady. "This is exactly what we came for." They ventured into the field, the corn closing in around them like a living thing. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the air grew colder. Priya adjusted her headphones, her face pale. "Guys, I'm picking up voices. They're saying names. Our names." Liam's hand trembled as he panned the camera. "Rachel, maybe we should." "No," Rachel snapped. "We're not leaving until we get something concrete." But the field had other plans. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when Kyle's EMF detector exploded in a shower of sparks. He dropped it with a curse, and the whispers turned to laughter, high-pitched, mocking, and utterly inhuman. The corn stalks began to sway violently, though there was no wind. Shadows darted between the rows, too fast to see clearly. "What the hell is that?" Liam shouted, his voice cracking. Rachel's bravado wavered for the first time. "Stay together," she ordered, but her voice shook. Then Priya screamed. She was yanked backward into the corn, her headphones torn from her head. The team scrambled after her, but she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Her screams echoed for a moment, then stopped abruptly. "We need to get out of here," Liam shouted, but the field seemed to have shifted. Every direction looked the same, and the whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices overlapping, calling their names. Kyle was next. He had been muttering prayers under his breath when the ground beneath him seemed to open up. He fell with a strangled cry, his hand reaching out for help, but there was nothing anyone could do. The earth closed over him as if he had never existed. Rachel and Liam ran, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. But the field was endless, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. The camera's red light flickered, and the footage it captured was fragmented, distorted. Glimpses of pale faces, hollow eyes, and clawed hands reaching out from the stalks. "Rachel!" Liam screamed, but it was too late. Something grabbed her, dragging her into the corn. Her camera fell to the ground, still recording. The last thing it captured was her face, twisted in terror, as she was pulled into the darkness. Liam was alone now, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stumbled through the field, the whispers closing in around him. He could see them now, the children, their faces gaunt and lifeless, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. They surrounded him, their whispers turning to screams, and he felt himself being pulled down into the earth. When the sun rose, the field was silent once more. The team's equipment was found scattered at the edge of the field, the camera's battery drained, its footage corrupted beyond repair. Of the explorers, there was no trace. But the whispers didn't stop. They never stopped. The curse unveiled. Years later, an elderly woman named Margaret moved into the Miller farm. She was a recluse, a historian who had spent her life studying local folklore. She had heard the stories of the whispering field, but she didn't believe in curses. She believed in answers. Margaret spent months researching the farm's history, digging through old records and interviewing the few locals who would speak to her. She learned that the Miller family had once been prosperous, their fields the most fertile in the region. But their success came at a cost. In the late 1800s, the Millers had made a pact with something ancient and malevolent, something that demanded a sacrifice in exchange for bountiful harvests. Every Halloween, they would offer a child to the field, their blood nourishing the soil. The practice continued for decades, until the townsfolk discovered the truth and burned the farm to the ground. But the field remained, cursed and hungry. Margaret's research led her to an old journal, hidden in the ruins of the farmhouse. It belonged to Samuel Miller, the last of his line. His final entry was a warning, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "The field is alive. It feeds on fear on souls. It will never stop. Do not enter. Do not listen. Do not let it take you." Margaret closed the journal, her hands trembling. She had always been a woman of reason, but the weight of the journal in her hands, the whispers she had begun to hear at night, they shook her to her core. On Halloween night, Margaret stood at the edge of the field, a lantern in her hand. The whispers were louder than ever, calling her name, promising her answers. She knew it was a trap, but she had to know. She had to see. She stepped into the field, the lantern's light casting long shadows. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the air grew colder. She could see them now. The children, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow. They reached for her, their fingers cold and lifeless. "I know your story," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "I know what was done to you." The children stopped, their whispers fading to silence. For a moment, there was peace. Then the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and the field erupted in a chorus of screams. The children's faces twisted in rage, their hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Margaret tried to run, but the field had her. The earth opened up beneath her, and she fell into the darkness, the lantern's light extinguished. When the sun rose, the field was silent once more. Margaret's lantern was found at the edge of the field, its glass shattered, its oil spilled. Of Margaret, there was no trace. The whispers continue to this day, calling to the curious, the brave, the foolish. The field is always hungry, and it will never stop. Do not enter. Do not listen. Do not let it take you. Years turned into decades, and the legend of the whispering field grew darker with each passing Halloween. The town nearby withered, its people either moving away or succumbing to the eerie pull of the field. Those who remained spoke of strange occurrences, lights flickering in the dead of night, children's laughter echoing from empty streets, and the faint smell of burnt corn wafting through the air. The field was no longer just a cursed place. It had become a living entity, a malevolent force that fed on fear and souls. But the field's hunger was not sated. It wanted more. It needed more. Unbeknownst to the townsfolk, a secret society had formed in the shadows, a cult that worshipped the field and the ancient entity that dwelled within it. They called themselves the Reapers, and they believed the field was a gateway to a realm beyond death, a place where they could achieve immortality. Every Halloween, they gathered at the edge of the field, dressed in tattered robes made of corn husks, and performed a ritual to appease the entity. Their leader, a man known only as the Harvester, claimed to hear the whispers more clearly than anyone else. He spoke of visions, of a great harvest that would bring the entity into the world, granting its followers unimaginable power. But the ritual required a sacrifice, not just one soul, but dozens. The Reapers began abducting people, vagrants, travelers, anyone who wouldn't be missed. They brought them to the field on Halloween night, binding them to wooden stakes driven into the cursed soil. The sacrifices screamed and begged, but the cultists showed no mercy. They chanted in a language older than time, their voices blending with the whispers of the field. As the final sacrifice was made, the ground trembled, and the air grew thick with the stench of rot. The field came alive, the cornstalks twisting and writhing like serpents. The entity emerged, a towering figure made of shadow and corn, its eyes glowing like embers, its mouth a gaping void. It consumed the sacrifices, their screams echoing into the night. The Harvester fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "We have done as you asked," he cried. "Grant us the power you promised." The entity turned its gaze upon him, and for a moment there was silence. Then it spoke, its voice a cacophony of whispers and screams. "You have served me well, but I hunger still." The Harvester's eyes widened in terror as the entity reached for him, its shadowy fingers wrapping around his throat. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The other cultists watched in horror as their leader was consumed, his body dissolving into ash. The entity turned to the remaining cultists, its hollow eyes burning with an insatiable hunger. One by one, it took them, their screams joining the chorus of the lost. Word of the cult's demise spread quickly, and a group of investigators arrived to uncover the truth. Among them was Dr. Evelyn Carter, a paranormal researcher, and her team. They had heard the stories of the Whispering Field and were determined to put an end to the curse once and for all. Evelyn was different from the others who had come before. She had spent her life studying ancient rituals and entities, and she believed the field could be destroyed. Her plan was simple: perform a counter-ritual to banish the entity back to whatever realm it had come from. The team arrived at the field on Halloween night, their equipment loaded into a van. The air was thick with tension, and the whispers were louder than ever. Evelyn ignored them, focusing on the task at hand. She set up a circle of salt around the field's perimeter, placing ancient relics at each cardinal point. Her team stood ready, their faces pale but determined. As the moon reached its zenith, Evelyn began the ritual. She chanted in a language older than time, her voice steady despite the growing unease. The field reacted violently, the cornstalks thrashing as if in pain. The whispers turned to screams, and the ground shook beneath their feet. The entity emerged, its form more monstrous than ever. It loomed over Evelyn, its eyes burning with rage. "You dare defy me!" it roared, its voice shaking the earth. Evelyn stood her ground, holding up a relic, a shard of obsidian inscribed with ancient runes. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice firm. "Return to the void." The entity lunged at her, but the circle of salt held it back. It howled in fury, its shadowy form flickering like a dying flame. Evelyn continued the chant, her voice growing louder, more powerful. The relics began to glow, their light piercing the darkness. The entity screamed, its form unraveling as the light consumed it. The field erupted in a blinding explosion of energy, and for a moment, everything was still. When the light faded, the field was gone. In its place was an empty expanse of barren earth, devoid of life. The whispers had stopped. Evelyn and her team left the town, their mission complete. The curse of the whispering field had been broken, and the entity vanished. But as they drove away, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of it. Years later, Evelyn received a package in the mail. Inside was a single ear of corn, blackened and brittle. Attached was a note, written in a shaky hand. "The harvest is never over." Evelyn's blood ran cold as she heard it, a faint whisper coming from the corn. She dropped the package and backed away, but the whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent. The field was gone, but the entity was not. It had found a new host, and it was hungry. The smiling man at the window. It was Halloween night, and the air outside was thick with the scent of fallen leaves and the faint echo of children's laughter from the streets below. Clara had decided to spend the evening alone in her apartment, nestled in the heart of the city. She wasn't one for parties or costumes, preferring the quiet comfort of her home. The flickering glow of a horror movie played on her TV, but her attention was divided between the screen and her phone, where she scrolled through social media. Then, at exactly 11:59 p.m., her phone buzzed. A single message appeared on the screen. "Turn around." Clara froze. The message was from an unknown number, and the words sent a chill down her spine. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as she stared at the screen. The rational part of her mind told her it was just a prank, some Halloween joke, but the sinking feeling in her gut urged her to listen. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window behind her. There, pressed against the glass, was a face. A gaunt, pale face with hollow eyes and an unnaturally wide grin that stretched far too wide for any human mouth. Its teeth were jagged, like broken glass, and its eyes gleamed with a malevolent light. Clara screamed, stumbling backward and knocking over a lamp in her panic. Her heart pounded as she fumbled for her phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. "There's someone outside my window," she gasped to the dispatcher. "Please, send someone. He's watching me." The dispatcher assured her that help was on the way, but when Clara turned back to the window, the figure was gone. The street outside was empty, the only movement coming from the swaying branches of a tree. She locked every window and door, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The police arrived within minutes, but after a thorough search of the area, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. "Are you sure you saw someone?" one officer asked, his tone skeptical. Clara nodded, her voice trembling. "I know what I saw. He was there. He was grinning at me." The officers left with a promise to patrol the area, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She spent the rest of the night huddled on her couch, clutching a kitchen knife, her eyes darting to every shadow. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted into a fitful sleep. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, and Clara woke with a start. Her neck was stiff from sleeping on the couch, and her mind was foggy with remnants of fear. She stood, stretching, and made her way to the kitchen to make coffee. That's when she saw it. On her kitchen table was a single photograph. Her blood ran cold as she picked it up. The photo showed her sleeping on the couch, her face peaceful in the dim light of the TV. The angle was unmistakable. It had been taken from inside her apartment. Clara's breath hitched, and she dropped the photo as if it had burned her. She spun around, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of an intruder. The apartment was silent, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She grabbed her phone and called the police again, her voice shaking as she explained what she'd found. While she waited for them to arrive, she noticed something else. The photo had writing on the back. In jagged, uneven letters it read, "I'm still here." The police conducted another search, but once again, they found nothing. No fingerprints, no signs of entry, no explanation for how the photo had ended up on her table. Clara insisted on staying somewhere else, and a friend offered her a place to crash for a few days. She packed a bag, her hands trembling as she threw clothes into a suitcase. But as she zipped it up, she heard a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from her closet. Clara's heart raced as she approached the closet door. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. She reached for the handle, her fingers brushing against the cold metal, and yanked it open. Inside, hanging from a hook, was a small, grotesque doll. Its face was twisted into the same wide grin she'd seen at the window, and its hollow eyes seemed to stare right through her. Taped to its chest was another note. "You can't run." Clara stumbled back, her scream catching in her throat. She grabbed her bag and bolted from the apartment, not stopping until she was outside in the bright daylight. She called her friend, who came to pick her up, and together they went to the police station to file another report. Days turned into weeks, and Clara tried to move on. She stayed with her friend, avoiding her apartment at all costs. The police continued to investigate, but with no leads, the case grew cold. Clara began to wonder if she was losing her mind. Maybe the stress of living alone had gotten to her. Maybe it had all been a terrible hallucination. But then, one night, as she was scrolling through her phone, she received another message. This time it was a video. Her hand shook as she pressed play. The video showed her apartment, empty and dark. The camera panned slowly, revealing every corner of the room, until it settled on the closet door. The door creaked open, and the gaunt figure stepped out, its grin wider than ever. It walked toward the camera, its movements jerky and unnatural, until its face filled the screen. Then, in a voice that sounded like nails scraping against glass, it whispered, "I'm coming for you." Clara dropped her phone, her scream echoing through the night. She knew then that it wasn't over. The figure wasn't just a prankster or a hallucination. It was something far worse, something that wouldn't stop until it had her. And it was closer than she thought. A week later, Clara's friend reported her missing. The police searched her apartment one last time, but they found no trace of her. The only clue was a single photograph left on the kitchen table. It showed Clara, her face frozen in a scream, as the gaunt figure loomed behind her, its grin stretching wider than ever. And on the back, written in jagged letters, were the words, "I found her." Clara's disappearance sent ripples of fear through her small circle of friends and the local community. The police, though baffled, continued their investigation, but the case grew colder with each passing day. Clara's apartment remained sealed, a silent tomb of unanswered questions. Her friend, Sarah, who had last seen her, was haunted by guilt and fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had taken Clara was still out there, watching, waiting. 3 months later, a young man named Ethan moved into Clara's old apartment. The rent was cheap, and the location was perfect for his new job in the city. The landlord, eager to fill the space, had glossed over the details of the previous tenant's disappearance. She just moved out suddenly, he said with a dismissive wave. Ethan didn't think much of it. He was a practical man, not one to believe in ghost stories or urban legends. But on his first night in the apartment, strange things began to happen. It started with the tapping. Late at night, as Ethan lay in bed, he heard a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the closet. He dismissed it as the building settling or pipes creaking, but the sound was too deliberate, too alive. When he opened the closet door, he found nothing but his clothes hanging neatly. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. The next morning, he found a photograph on the kitchen table. It was a picture of him sleeping, taken from inside the apartment. His blood ran cold as he stared at it, the memory of Clara's disappearance flooding his mind. He called the police, but just like before, they found no evidence of an intruder. Ethan decided to take matters into his own hands. He began researching Clara's disappearance, digging through old news articles and police reports. One day, while cleaning out a drawer in the bedroom, he found a hidden compartment. Inside was a journal, its pages filled with Clara's frantic handwriting. The entries detailed her terror in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She wrote about the messages, the figure at the window, and the photographs. But there was something else, a pattern she had noticed. The figure only appeared at night, and it seemed to grow stronger the more she feared it. In one of the last entries, she wrote, "I think it's feeding on my fear. It's not human. It's something else, something ancient. It's been here before, in this apartment. I found old newspapers from the 1920s under the floorboards. There were reports of disappearances, just like mine. It's been doing this for decades, maybe longer. I don't know how to stop it." Ethan's hands trembled as he read the words. He felt a chill crawl up his spine, as if the figure were standing behind him, watching him read. He turned around, but the room was empty. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan followed Clara's research. He pried up the floorboards in the living room and found a stack of yellowed newspapers, just as she had described. The articles told of a series of unexplained disappearances in the building, each one marked by the same chilling details. Strange messages, photographs, and a gaunt, grinning figure. But there was something else. Buried beneath the newspapers was a small, ornate box. Inside was a piece of parchment covered in strange symbols and a handwritten note in English. The note described a ritual, a way to banish the entity. According to the text, the figure was a shadow spirit, a malevolent being that fed on fear and trapped its victims in a nightmarish realm. The ritual required 3 things: a lock of the victim's hair, a mirror, and a blood offering. Ethan's heart raced as he realized what he had to do. He found a strand of Clara's hair stuck in the journal and gathered the other items. That night, he performed the ritual, following the instructions carefully. He placed the hair in front of the mirror, pricked his finger, and let a drop of blood fall onto the parchment. As he chanted the words written on the note, the room grew colder, and the air seemed to hum with energy. Suddenly, the mirror began to fog up. Ethan's reflection disappeared, replaced by the gaunt figure. Its grin widened as it reached out, its bony fingers pressing against the glass. The mirror cracked, and a low, guttural laugh filled the room. "You think you can stop me?" the figure hissed. "You're too late. She's mine." Ethan woke up in a dark, unfamiliar place. The air was thick and heavy, and the ground beneath him felt like cold, damp earth. He stood, his heart pounding, and realized he wasn't alone. Clara was there, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Ethan," she whispered, "how did you get here?" "I tried to save you," he said, his voice trembling. "I performed the ritual, but something went wrong." Clara shook her head. "The ritual doesn't banish it. It opens a door. You've trapped yourself here with me." Ethan's stomach dropped as the figure appeared behind Clara, its grin stretching impossibly wide. It reached out, its fingers brushing against her shoulder, and she screamed as she was pulled into the darkness. Ethan ran, but the shadowy realm seemed to stretch on forever. He could hear the figure's laughter echoing around him, taunting him. He knew he couldn't escape, but he had to try. Back in the real world, the police found Ethan's apartment empty. On the kitchen table was a single photograph. It showed Ethan and Clara, their faces frozen in terror, as the gaunt figure loomed behind them. On the back of the photo, written in jagged letters, were the words, "I have them both." The apartment was sealed once again, but the story didn't end there. A year later, a new tenant moved in, drawn by the cheap rent and the convenient location. On their first night, they received a message on their phone, "Turn around," and the cycle began again. The apartment building at 317 Ashwood Lane had become a cursed relic in the city, a place whispered about in hushed tones. Despite its dark history, it continued to attract tenants, drawn by the impossibly low rent and the landlord's carefully crafted lies. But those who moved in never stayed long. Some vanished without a trace. Others fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind their belongings and their sanity. The police had long since given up on solving the mysteries of 317 Ashwood. The disappearances were too bizarre, the evidence too sparse. The only constant was the photographs, always left on the kitchen table, always showing the victims in moments of terror, always accompanied by the same chilling message, "I have them." But the truth behind the grinning figure and its endless cycle of horror was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Deep beneath the apartment building, hidden behind a wall of crumbling brick and ancient mortar, lay a forgotten chamber. Inside was an altar, stained with centuries of dried blood, and a mirror framed in tarnished silver. The mirror was no ordinary object. It was a gateway, a portal to a realm of shadows where the grinning figure dwelled. The figure was not a ghost or a demon, but something far older. It was a harbinger, a being born from humanity's collective fear of the unknown. It had been summoned long ago by a cult that worshipped the darkness, feeding its sacrifices to gain its favor. But the cult had been destroyed, and the harbinger had been trapped in its realm, bound by the mirror. Over the years, the mirror's power had weakened, and the harbinger had found a way to reach through, first as a whisper, then as a shadow, and finally as a physical presence. It fed on fear, growing stronger with each victim it claimed, and it had chosen 317 Ashwood as its hunting ground. The harbinger's cycle was simple, yet horrifying. It would lure its victims with messages and photographs, feeding on their terror until they were too weak to resist. Then it would drag them into its realm, where they would become part of its endless nightmare. But the harbinger was not content with just one victim at a time. It wanted more. It wanted to break free. Each disappearance weakened the barrier between worlds, and the harbinger grew closer to escaping. It needed one final sacrifice, a soul strong enough to shatter the mirror and open the gateway completely. And it had found that soul in Clara. Clara was not an ordinary victim. She was a seer, someone with a natural connection to the spirit world. The harbinger had sensed her power the moment she moved into the apartment. It had tormented her, feeding on her fear, but it had also been testing her. Clara's ability to see the harbinger, to resist its influence, made her the perfect key to its freedom. When Ethan performed the ritual, he had unknowingly played into the harbinger's hands. The ritual was not meant to banish the entity. It was meant to strengthen the connection between worlds. By entering the shadow realm, Ethan had given the harbinger the final piece it needed, a second seer. In the shadow realm, Clara and Ethan fought to survive. The harbinger taunted them, showing them visions of their worst fears. But Clara had been studying the entity, learning its weaknesses. She realized that the mirror was the source of its power and its prison. If they could destroy the mirror from within the shadow realm, they could trap the harbinger forever. But there was a catch. Destroying the mirror would require a sacrifice. Someone would have to stay behind, their soul bound to the mirror to keep the harbinger trapped. Clara knew what she had to do. Clara and Ethan made their way to the mirror, the harbinger close behind. Its laughter echoed through the darkness, a sound that made their blood run cold. As they reached the mirror, Clara turned to Ethan. "You have to go back," she said. "Tell everyone what happened. Make sure no one ever opens that door again." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not leaving you." Clara smiled, tears in her eyes. "You have to. This is the only way to stop it." Before Ethan could protest, Clara shoved him through the mirror. He stumbled back into the apartment, the real world crashing around him. The mirror shattered behind him, its shards scattering across the floor. Ethan was found hours later, unconscious and covered in blood. He told the police everything, but they dismissed his story as the ravings of a traumatized man. The apartment was sealed and the building was condemned. But Ethan knew the truth. The harbinger was trapped, but it wasn't gone. Clara's soul was bound to the mirror, her sacrifice keeping the entity at bay. But the mirror's shards still existed, scattered and hidden. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, the harbinger waited, its grin widening as it plotted its next move. Years later, Ethan received a package in the mail. Inside was a photograph. It showed Clara, her face peaceful, standing in front of the shattered mirror. On the back, written in her handwriting, was a message. "It's not over. Be careful. It's still watching." Ethan's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. The harbinger had found a way to reach out again, and this time, it wouldn't stop until it was free. The cycle had begun anew. The mask that wouldn't come off. It was a chilly October night, and the air was thick with the scent of pumpkin spice and decaying leaves. Jason and his friends had been scouring the town's thrift stores for last-minute Halloween costumes. The party at the old Henderson mansion was the event of the season, and everyone wanted to look their best, or their worst. In a dimly lit corner of the thrift store, Jason stumbled upon a peculiar mask. It was old, its surface cracked and yellowed like ancient parchment. The mask's expression was haunting, a grotesque blend of a smile and a scream, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow him as he moved. The tag on it read, "Handcrafted for Hallows Eve, 1893. "Perfect," Jason muttered, slipping it over his face. It fit snugly, as if it had been molded just for him. His friends laughed at how creepy it looked, but Jason felt a strange thrill. He couldn't wait to show it off at the party. The Henderson mansion was alive with flickering candlelight and the sound of laughter. Jason's mask was a hit. People couldn't stop staring at it. But as the night wore on, Jason began to feel off. The mask felt heavier, as if it were sinking into his skin. He tried to take it off, but it wouldn't budge. "Guys, help me," he said, his voice tinged with panic. His friends gathered around, tugging at the edges of the mask, but it was as if it had fused to his face. Maybe it stuck with glue or something. One of them joked, but the laughter died when Jason's voice suddenly deepened, becoming guttural and unnatural. His posture stiffened, his movements jerky and mechanical. His eyes, visible through the mask's hollow sockets, turned glassy and lifeless. "Jason," his friend Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Jason's head tilted at an unnatural angle, and a low, gurgling laugh escaped his lips. "I'm fine," he said, but the words sounded wrong, as if they were being forced through a throat that wasn't his own. The partygoers began to back away, their unease growing. Jason's friends tried to pull him aside, but he resisted with inhuman strength. His breathing became ragged, and his skin beneath the mask began to ripple and bulge, as if something were moving underneath. "Get off," Jason screamed, his voice a mix of terror and something else, something ancient and malevolent. His hands clawed at the mask, but it was no use. The mask was part of him now. Emily grabbed a pair of scissors from the kitchen and tried to cut the straps, but as soon as the blade touched the mask, It let out a piercing shriek that echoed through the mansion. The lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, Jason was gone. The search for Jason lasted all night. His friends scoured the mansion, the surrounding woods, and the streets of the town, but there was no sign of him. It wasn't until dawn that they found him, or what was left of him. He was standing in the middle of the town square, the mask still fused to his face. But it wasn't just a mask anymore. His skin had stretched and warped, merging with the grotesque features of the mask. His mouth was now a permanent, twisted grin, his eyes hollow and black. His body was hunched and elongated, his fingers ending in sharp, bony claws. "Jason," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. The thing that was once Jason turned to her, its head jerking unnaturally. When it spoke, its voice was a cacophony of whispers, as if 100 voices were speaking at once. "I am free," it rasped. "The Hollow's Eve has come." The townspeople tried to destroy the creature, but it was no use. Bullets passed through it like smoke, and fire only seemed to make it stronger. By nightfall, the creature had vanished, leaving behind a trail of destruction and despair. The next morning, the thrift store was gone, burned to the ground. But in the ashes, they found a single, unblemished mask, its grotesque smile staring up at them. And every year, on Hollow's Eve, the mask reappears, waiting for its next victim. Some say it's cursed, a relic of a forgotten ritual meant to summon something unspeakable. Others believe it's alive, feeding on the souls of those who wear it. But one thing is certain: once the mask is on, it never comes off. And when it does, what's left behind is no longer human. To this day, the legend of the Hollow's Eve mask persists. People claim to see a tall, hunched figure wandering the woods on Halloween night, its hollow eyes glowing in the darkness. And if you listen closely, you might hear its guttural whisper on the wind: "Put on a mask and set me free." The town of Black Hollow was never the same after that fateful Halloween. The disappearance of Jason and the grotesque transformation that followed became the stuff of nightmares, whispered about in hushed tones around flickering campfires. But the horror didn't end with Jason. It was only the beginning. A year later, on the eve of Halloween, the mask reappeared. This time, it was found by a young woman named Clara, who had moved to Black Hollow to escape her troubled past. She stumbled upon it in an antique shop that hadn't been there the day before. The shopkeeper, an old man with milky eyes and a crooked smile, insisted the mask was one of a kind. "It's special," he said, his voice dripping with an eerie certainty. "It chooses its wearer." Clara, desperate for a unique costume, bought the mask without a second thought. That night, she wore it to the town's Halloween festival. At first, it was a hit. People couldn't stop staring at its haunting expression. But as the clock struck midnight, Clara began to feel the same unease Jason had experienced a year prior. The mask wouldn't come off. Her friends tried to help, but just like with Jason, their efforts were in vain. Clara's voice deepened, her movements became stiff and unnatural, and her eyes turned hollow. By dawn, she was gone, leaving behind only a trail of claw marks and a faint, guttural laughter echoing in the distance. The pattern repeated itself year after year. The mask would appear in a different location: a dusty attic, a roadside stall, even left on someone's doorstep, and someone would inevitably put it on. Each time, the result was the same: a grotesque transformation, a night of terror, and the birth of another monstrous figure that roamed the woods of Black Hollow. The townspeople tried everything to stop the curse. They burned the mask, buried it, even threw it into the bottomless lake at the edge of town. But no matter what they did, it always returned, pristine and unblemished, as if it had never been touched. As the years passed, a dark rumor began to circulate. Some claimed the mask was part of an ancient ritual a gateway for an entity that had been imprisoned centuries ago. According to legend, the town of Black Hollow was built on the site of a forgotten cult that worshipped a being known as the Hollow One. The cult had been eradicated, but their curse lived on through the mask. A group of townsfolk, desperate for answers, began to dig into the town's history. They uncovered old journals and cryptic symbols hidden in the walls of the abandoned church on the hill. The journals spoke of a ritual that required 7 sacrifices, 7 souls to wear the mask and become vessels for the Hollow One. Once the 7th transformation was complete, the entity would be fully unleashed, and the world would be plunged into eternal darkness. The townsfolk counted the victims: Jason, Clara, and 5 others. 6 transformations. Only one more to go on the 7th Halloween since Jason's disappearance. The mask appeared once more. This time, it was found by a boy named Tommy, who had always been fascinated by the town's dark legends. His older sister, Emily, the same Emily who had tried to save Jason, found him wearing the mask in his room. "Take it off," she screamed, her voice trembling with fear. But it was too late. Tommy's eyes had already turned hollow, his voice a guttural whisper. Emily tried to pull the mask off, but it was fused to his face. She watched in horror as his skin began to ripple and warp, his body twisting into something inhuman. The room filled with a deafening shriek, and the walls seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy. As the transformation completed, the ground beneath the town began to shake. The sky turned blood red, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. From the woods, 6 grotesque figures emerged: Jason, Clara, and the others, their hollow eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. They surrounded the town, their guttural voices chanting in unison. Emily realized the truth. Tommy was the 7th sacrifice. The ritual was complete. The Hollow One was free. The town of Black Hollow was never seen again. Those who ventured near the area reported hearing faint whispers and guttural laughter echoing through the trees. Some claimed to see the 7 figures roaming the woods, their hollow eyes glowing in the darkness. As for the mask, it vanished without a trace. But every Halloween, in towns far and wide, people report finding an old, cracked mask with a grotesque smile and hollow eyes. And every year, someone inevitably puts it on, because the curse of the Hollow One is never truly gone. It waits, patient and hungry, for the next soul to wear the mask, and the next and the next. And when the 7th sacrifice comes, the endless night will begin again. The town of Black Hollow was gone, swallowed by the earth itself. The ground had cracked open like a festering wound, and from the depths emerged a swirling, black void that pulsed with a malevolent energy. The 7 transformed figures, Jason, Clara, Tommy, and the others, stood at the edge of the abyss, their hollow eyes fixed on the darkness below. Their guttural chants grew louder, echoing across the desolate landscape. Emily, the last survivor of Black Hollow, watched in horror from a distance. She had tried to save Tommy, but the mask's curse was too powerful. Now, she was the only one left to witness the culmination of the ancient ritual. The air was thick with dread, and the sky above churned with storm clouds that blotted out the sun. It was as if the world itself was recoiling from what was about to happen. The ground trembled violently as a massive, clawed hand emerged from the void. It was followed by another, and then a grotesque, shadowy figure began to pull itself free. The Hollow One, a being of pure darkness, its form shifting and writhing like smoke, rose from the abyss. Its eyes burned like twin suns, and its voice was a deafening roar that shook the earth. "I am free," it bellowed, its words reverberating through the air like thunder. The 7 figures bowed before their master, their twisted bodies trembling with reverence. The Hollow One stretched its massive form, its shadow engulfing the land. Trees withered and died, rivers turned to ash, and the sky itself seemed to bleed. The world was being consumed by its presence. Emily knew she had to do something. She couldn't let the Hollow One destroy everything. Desperate, she turned to the old journal she had found in the abandoned church. Among the cryptic symbols and warnings, she discovered a passage that spoke of a way to banish the entity, a counter-ritual that required the destruction of the mask and the sacrifice of a pure soul. But the mask was gone, and Emily had no idea where to find it. As she frantically searched the ruins of the town, she heard a faint whisper in the wind. It was Tommy's voice, weak and strained, calling out to her. "Emily, help me." She followed the voice to the edge of the abyss, where she found the mask lying on the ground. It was cracked and broken, its hollow eyes staring up at her. Tommy's voice seemed to emanate from it, as if a fragment of his soul was still trapped inside. "You have to destroy it," Tommy whispered. "It's the only way." Emily picked up the mask, her hands trembling. She could feel its dark energy pulsing through her, but she held on tight. She knew what she had to do. Emily ran to the center of the town, where the Hollow One loomed over the land. The entity turned its burning eyes toward her, and a low, guttural laugh escaped its shadowy form. "You cannot stop me," it roared. Emily ignored the fear coursing through her veins. She held the mask high above her head and shouted the words she had read in the journal, an incantation in a language she didn't understand but felt in her soul. The mask began to glow, its cracks filling with a blinding light. The Hollow One let out a deafening scream as the light spread, engulfing the 7 transformed figures. One by one, they disintegrated into ash, their hollow eyes fading into nothingness. The entity itself began to writhe and convulse, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. But the ritual required a sacrifice, a pure soul. Emily knew what that meant. She closed her eyes and whispered Tommy's name, offering herself in his place. The light from the mask grew brighter, consuming her body and spreading across the land. When the light faded, the Hollow One was gone. The abyss had closed, and the land was eerily silent. The mask lay shattered on the ground, its pieces crumbling to dust. Emily was nowhere to be found. In the years that followed, the town of Black Hollow became a ghost town, its ruins overgrown with vegetation. People avoided the area, claiming it was cursed. But every Halloween, strange things would happen. Lights would flicker in the abandoned houses, and faint whispers could be heard in the wind. Some say Emily's spirit still lingers, guarding the land from the return of the Hollow One. Others believe the mask is still out there, waiting for its next victim. And in the darkest corners of the world, there are those who whisper of a new ritual, a way to bring the Hollow One back. But one thing is certain: the curse of the Hollow's Eve mask is never truly gone. It waits, patient and hungry, for the next soul to wear it, and the next and the next. And when the 7th sacrifice comes, the endless night will begin again. The midnight call. Sarah had always been a sound sleeper, but that changed on the first night. The phone rang at exactly midnight, shattering the silence of her small, quiet home. Groggy and disoriented, she fumbled for the device on her nightstand. The screen glowed with an unknown number. She answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Come outside," a voice whispered. It was low, almost guttural, and sent a chill down her spine. Sarah froze. The voice didn't sound human, not entirely. It was as if it were being forced through a throat that didn't know how to speak. She hung up immediately, her heart pounding. A prank, she told herself. Just some idiot trying to scare me. But the next night, it happened again. The same time, the same whisper. "Come outside." This time, Sarah felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. She threw the phone down, pulled the blankets over her head, and tried to ignore the creeping dread that settled in her chest. She didn't sleep a wink. By the 3rd night, Sarah was a wreck. She sat on her bed, staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring. When it did, she almost screamed. The same number, the same whisper. Come outside. This time, something in her snapped. Anger mixed with fear, and she stormed to the window, yanking the curtains open. What she saw made her blood run cold. There, in the middle of her yard, stood a figure. It was her. Her. The same face, the same hair, even the same pajamas she was wearing. But the smile, oh, the smile was wrong. It was too wide, too sharp, stretching across her doppelganger's face like a grotesque mask. The figure raised a hand and waved slowly, its eyes locked on hers. Sarah stumbled back, her breath coming in short, panic gasps. She slammed the curtains shut and grabbed her phone, dialing her parents' number with trembling fingers. No answer. She tried her brother. Nothing. Desperate, she called 911, but the line was dead. The house felt heavier, darker, as if the walls were closing in. The next morning, her family arrived to check on her. They found the house eerily silent. The doors were locked from the inside, the windows intact. But Sarah was gone. Her bed was neatly made, her clothes still in the closet. The only sign of her was her phone, sitting on the nightstand, ringing incessantly. Her mother picked it up, her face pale. Come outside, the voice whispered. Her mother dropped the phone like it had burned her. The family searched the house, the yard, the neighborhood, but there was no trace of Sarah. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Days turned into weeks, and the family tried to move on, though the memory of that night haunted them. Then, one evening, Sarah's brother, Mark, was alone in the house. He had been avoiding Sarah's room, but curiosity got the better of him. He stepped inside, the air thick and heavy. The phone on the nightstand began to ring. Mark's stomach churned. He knew he shouldn't answer, but something compelled him. He picked it up. Come outside, the voice whispered. Mark's blood turned to ice. He dropped the phone and ran to the window. There, in the yard, stood Sarah. But it wasn't her. Not really. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow, empty pits. She smiled that same too wide smile and beckoned him forward. Mark slammed the window shut and backed away, his heart racing. He grabbed his keys and bolted from the house, vowing never to return. But as he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Sarah was in the back seat, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her smile stretching wider and wider. The car crashed that night. Mark survived, but he was never the same. He refused to speak of what he saw, only muttering about the phone and the voice. The family moved away, hoping to escape the nightmare. But the calls followed them. Every midnight, without fail, the phone would ring. And every time, someone would answer. Because curiosity is a dangerous thing. Years later, the house stood abandoned, a rotting shell of its former self. But if you were passed by at exactly midnight, you might hear the faint sound of a phone ringing. And if you were foolish enough to answer, you'd hear the whisper, "Come outside." And if you looked, you'd see them. Sarah, Mark, others, all standing in the yard, smiling that same terrible smile. Waiting, watching, because the voice doesn't just want to scare you. It wants you to join them, forever. And once you see them, it's already too late. The abandoned house became a local legend. Teenagers dared each other to spend the night inside, but none ever stayed past dusk. The air around the property was unnaturally cold, even in the height of summer, and the faint sound of a phone ringing could sometimes be heard from the street. Those who got too close reported seeing shadows moving behind the windows, even though the house had been empty for years. One night, a group of 4 friends, Emma, Jake, Mia, and Lucas, decided to break into the house. They were thrill seekers, obsessed with the supernatural, and convinced the stories were just that, stories. Armed with flashlights and a camera, they sneaked onto the property, their laughter echoing in the stillness of the night. The front door creaked open, as if expecting them. The air inside was thick and stale, and the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as though the house itself were alive. Emma shivered but brushed it off. "This place is creepy, but it's just an old house," she said, trying to convince herself as much as the others. They split up to explore, promising to meet back in the living room in an hour. Jake and Mia went upstairs, while Emma and Lucas stayed on the ground floor. As they wandered through the dusty rooms, Lucas noticed something strange. The furniture was untouched, as if frozen in time. A half-empty cup of coffee sat on the kitchen table, still warm to the touch. Emma picked up a photo frame from the mantelpiece. It was a picture of Sarah and her family, but Sarah's face was blurred, as if someone had smudged it out. Upstairs, Jake and Mia found Sarah's room. The bed was neatly made, just as the stories had described. Mia's flashlight flickered as she stepped inside, and the temperature dropped sharply. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. Jake nodded, his bravado fading. On the nightstand, Sarah's phone sat untouched, its screen dark. Mia reached for it, but Jake grabbed her arm. "Don't," he said. "We don't know what's." The phone rang. The shrill sound made them both jump. Mia hesitated, then picked it up. "Hello," she said, her voice trembling. "Come outside," the voice whispered. Mia dropped the phone and backed away, her face pale. "We need to get out of here," she said. Jake didn't argue. They ran downstairs, where Emma and Lucas were waiting. The group quickly shared what had happened, their fear feeding off each other. As they turned to leave, the front door slammed shut on its own. The phone in Sarah's room began to ring again, the sound echoing through the house. Then another phone rang, and another. Soon, every room was filled with the cacophony of ringing phones. The friends covered their ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside their heads. "Come outside." The whispers began, overlapping, growing louder and more distorted. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing heavier. Emma screamed as a shadowy figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was Sarah, her face twisted into that same grotesque smile. Behind her, more figures emerged. Mark, and others they didn't recognize. Their eyes were hollow, their movements jerky and unnatural. The friends tried to run, but the house had other plans. Doors slammed shut, trapping them. The windows were no longer exits, but mirrors, reflecting their terrified faces back at them. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Come outside, come outside, come outside." One by one, the friends succumbed. Jake was the first. He stopped running and turned to face the figures, his expression blank. He walked toward them, disappearing into the shadows. Mia followed, then Lucas. Emma fought the longest, but the whispers were in her mind now, impossible to ignore. She opened the front door and stepped outside. The next morning, the house was silent once more. The phone stopped ringing. The shadows retreated. But if you were to pass by at midnight, you might see them, Emma, Jake, Mia, and Lucas, standing in the yard, their smiles too wide, their eyes empty. And if you were foolish enough to answer the call, you'd hear the whisper, "Come outside." Because the curse of the midnight caller is never satisfied. It always needs more. And once you hear the voice, there's no escape. You'll join them, forever. Years turned into decades, and the legend of the midnight caller grew darker with each passing generation. The house remained untouched, a black stain on the edge of town, its story whispered in hushed tones around campfires and in schoolyards. But no one dared to investigate further. Not after what happened to Emma, Jake, Mia, and Lucas. Their faces now joined the others in the yard, their hollow eyes and twisted smiles forever frozen in time. Then, one day, a woman named Claire arrived in town. She was a paranormal investigator, drawn to the house by the countless stories she'd heard. Claire was different from the others. She wasn't just curious. She was determined to uncover the truth. She believed the curse could be broken, and she was willing to risk everything to try. Claire spent weeks researching the house's history. She dug through old records, interviewed the few remaining locals who would speak to her, and pieced together a chilling timeline. The house had been built in the early 1900s by a reclusive man named Elias Varnes. He was a scientist, obsessed with the idea of immortality. According to the records, Elias had conducted experiments in the house, attempting to cheat death by transferring his consciousness into other bodies. But something went horribly wrong. One night, Elias vanished, leaving behind a house filled with strange devices and journals filled with cryptic notes. The townsfolk avoided the property, believing it to be cursed. Decades later, Sarah's family moved in, unaware of the house's dark past, and the rest, as they say, was history. Claire knew she had to enter the house. She prepared meticulously, bringing protective charms, holy water, and a recorder to document everything. As midnight approached, she stood on the porch, her heart pounding. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the house knew she was coming. The door creaked open on its own, and Claire stepped inside. The atmosphere was oppressive, the walls seeming to pulse with a faint, unnatural rhythm. She made her way to Sarah's room, where the phone sat on the nightstand, its screen dark. Claire set up her equipment and waited. At exactly midnight, the phone rang. Claire took a deep breath and answered. "Hello," she said, her voice steady. "Come outside," the voice whispered. This time, Claire didn't hesitate. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not playing your game. Tell me what you want." The line went silent for a moment. Then the voice returned, louder and more distorted. "Free us." Claire's mind raced. "Who are you?" she demanded. "We are the trapped," the voice replied. "Elias bound us here. He used us for his experiments. He took our bodies, our voices, our lives. We cannot rest. We cannot leave. You must break the circle." Claire's eyes widened as she understood. The figures in the yard weren't just victims. They were vessels, their bodies hijacked by Elias's twisted experiments. The curse wasn't just a malevolent force. It was a prison, holding the souls of those Elias had wronged. "How do I break the circle?" Claire asked. "Find the source," the voice said. "Destroy it." The line went dead. Claire grabbed her flashlight and began searching the house. She tore through walls, ripped up floorboards, and finally discovered hidden basement. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls were covered in strange symbols. In the center of the room was a machine, its gears rusted but still faintly humming. Attached to it were jars filled with a dark, swirling liquid. Souls, Claire realized with horror. She knew what she had to do. Using a crowbar, she smashed the machine, piece by piece. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, more frantic. The jars began to crack, the liquid inside evaporating into the air. The house shook violently, as if it were alive and in pain. Finally, with one last blow, the machine shattered. The whispers stopped. The house fell silent. Claire stumbled outside, gasping for air. The yard was empty. The figures were gone. The curse was broken, but as she turned to leave, she heard a faint sound behind her. The phone, lying in the grass, began to ring. Claire hesitated, then picked it up. "Thank you," the voice said, soft and gentle. Then the line went dead for good. The house was demolished soon after, its dark history finally laid to rest. Claire left town, but she never forgot what she had seen. And though the curse was broken, she sometimes wondered if Elias Varnes' soul had truly been destroyed, or if it had simply found a new vessel. Because some evils never truly die, they just wait for the right moment to return. The house that eats trick-or-treaters. The town of Black Hollow was a quiet, unassuming place, nestled deep within a dense forest that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The townsfolk were simple people, content with their lives, but there was one thing that always lingered in the back of their minds, a dark secret that they dared not speak of, especially not to outsiders. It was the legend of the house on Hollow Hill. The house was an ancient, crumbling structure, its windows shattered and its roof sagging under the weight of time. It stood alone at the top of the hill, surrounded by gnarled trees that seemed to twist and writhe in the moonlight. The townsfolk claimed that the house was cursed, that it had been built by a madman over a century ago, and that it had been the site of unspeakable horrors. They said that the house was alive, that it hungered for the souls of the living, and that every Halloween it demanded a sacrifice. The children of Black Hollow, however, were not so easily frightened. They had grown up hearing the stories, but to them, it was just that, a story. Every year, as Halloween approached, they would dare each other to knock on the door of the house, to prove that they were brave enough to face the legend. And every year, one of them would disappear. It had started 10 years ago with a boy named Tommy. He had been the first to knock on the door, and when it creaked open, he had stepped inside, laughing at the others for being too scared to follow. But the laughter had died in their throats when the door slammed shut behind him, and he was never seen again. The next year, it had been a girl named Sarah. She had been dared to go inside and retrieve something, anything, to prove that she had been there. She had hesitated at the door, but the taunts of her friends had driven her forward. She had stepped inside, and the door had slammed shut. She, too, had vanished without a trace. And so it went, year after year. The house claimed another victim every Halloween, and no one knew where they went, only that they were never seen again. The townsfolk tried to warn the children, but they were young and foolish, and they believed themselves invincible. They thought it was just a game, a harmless dare. They didn't understand the true horror of the house on Hollow Hill. It was Halloween night, and the air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves and the promise of mischief. A group of kids had gathered at the edge of the forest, their breath visible in the cold night air. They were laughing and joking, their voices carrying through the trees, but there was an undercurrent of tension, a nervous energy that none of them would admit to. At the center of the group was a boy named Jake. He was the ringleader, the one who always came up with the dares, and tonight was no different. He had been talking about the house on Hollow Hill for weeks, and now, as the moon rose high in the sky, he was ready to put his plan into action. "All right," Jake said, his voice dripping with mock seriousness. "Who's brave enough to knock on the door of the haunted house?" The kids exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke up. They had all heard the stories, and even though they pretended not to believe them, the thought of stepping inside that house sent a shiver down their spines. Jake smirked. "What? No takers? I thought you guys were supposed to be brave." "I'll do it," a voice said, breaking the silence. All eyes turned to a girl named Emily. She was new to the town, and she had a reputation for being fearless. She had only been in Black Hollow for a few months, but she had already made a name for herself by doing things that the other kids wouldn't dare try. She had climbed the tallest tree in the forest, swum across the lake at night, and even spent an entire evening in the town's abandoned cemetery. This, however, was different. Jake raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that, Emily? You know what happened to the others, right?" Emily shrugged. "It's just a stupid story. There's no such thing as haunted houses." The other kids exchanged nervous glances, but no one tried to stop her. They were too curious, too eager to see what would happen. Jake handed her a flashlight, and with a determined look on her face, Emily set off up the hill towards the house. The house loomed before her, its dark silhouette cutting through the night sky like a jagged knife. The wind howled through the trees, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Emily hesitated for a moment, her hand trembling as she reached for the door. But then she steeled herself, took a deep breath, and knocked. The sound echoed through the empty house, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, with a slow, agonizing creak, the door began to open. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped inside, the flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The air was cold and damp, and the floorboards groaned beneath her feet. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, as if it were alive, watching her every move. She moved deeper into the house, her flashlight flickering as she explored the rooms. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust. It looked as though no one had lived there for decades, but there was something about the house that felt wrong. As she turned a corner, she found herself in a long, narrow hallway. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar, with a faint light shining through the crack. Emily's curiosity got the better of her as she moved towards the door, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The room was filled with mirrors, dozens of them, lining the walls from floor to ceiling. In the center of the room was a single, ornate mirror, its frame carved with strange, twisting symbols. The light she had seen was coming from the mirror, but it wasn't a reflection of the room. Instead, it showed a dark, twisted version of the house, with walls that seemed to pulse and writhe like living flesh. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer to the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with wide, terrified eyes. But then, something moved in the reflection, a shadow, creeping up behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. When she turned back to the mirror, her reflection was gone. In its place was a figure, shrouded in darkness, with glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce her very soul. The figure reached out, its hand breaking through the surface of the mirror, and before Emily could scream, it grabbed her and pulled her into the darkness. The kids waited at the bottom of the hill, their laughter fading as the minutes turned into hours. Emily never came back out. The next morning, the townsfolk found the house empty, just as they had every year. But this time, something was different. The mirrors in the house were shattered, and the walls were covered in strange, bloody symbols. And in the center of the room, where the ornate mirror had once stood, was a single word, scrawled in blood. More. The townsfolk tried to seal the house, to burn it to the ground, but no matter what they did, it always remained standing. And every Halloween, the house would claim another victim, drawing them in with its dark, twisted magic. No one knows where the victims go, or what happens to them inside the house. But some say that if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can hear their voices, whispering from the shadows, begging for someone to set them free. And so, the legend of the house on Hollow Hill lives on, a dark reminder of the horrors that lurk in the shadows, waiting for the next brave soul to knock on its door. Years passed, and the legend of the house on Hollow Hill grew darker with each Halloween. The townsfolk of Black Hollow tried to forget, to bury the horror beneath the mundane rhythms of their lives. But the house was always there, looming on the hill, a silent predator waiting for its next victim. Parents warned their children, teachers told cautionary tales, and even the bravest of souls avoided the forest path that led to the cursed house. Yet, every year, without fail, some foolish or curious soul would dare to knock on that door and vanish. But something was changing. The house was no longer content with just one victim. One crisp October evening, a family moved into Black Hollow. They were outsiders, unaware of the town's dark secret. The parents, Mark and Linda, were seeking a fresh start after a series of personal tragedies. Their teenage daughter, Lily, was quiet and introspective, while their young son, Max, was full of energy and curiosity. They bought a quaint little house at the edge of town, just a stone's throw from the forest. The townsfolk were hesitant to warn them. They didn't want to scare the newcomers away, but they also didn't want another tragedy on their hands. Eventually, an elderly woman named Mrs. Grayson took it upon herself to visit the family. She brought a basket of homemade bread and a grim warning. "Stay away from the house on Hollow Hill," she said, her voice trembling, "especially on Halloween. It's not a place for the living." Mark laughed it off, dismissing it as superstitious nonsense. Linda, however, felt a chill run down her spine. She thanked Mrs. Grayson, but didn't press for details. Lily, who had been listening from the stairs, felt a strange pull toward the house, as if it were calling to her. Halloween night arrived, and the town was alive with the usual festivities. Children in costumes roamed the streets, collecting candy, while adults gathered for bonfires and storytelling. But Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had been having nightmares for weeks. Visions of a dark house, a creaking door, and a mirror that showed her a version of herself she didn't recognize. That night, as the clock struck midnight, Lily woke to the sound of knocking. Not at their front door, but somewhere in the distance. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, as if it were inside her head. She looked out her window and saw a faint light flickering in the forest, leading up to the hill. Against her better judgment, Lily slipped out of the house and followed the light. The forest was eerily silent, the usual sounds of crickets and owls absent. The only noise was the rhythmic knocking, growing louder with each step she took. When she reached the house, the door was already open, just a crack. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around her. "Come in, Lily." She stepped inside. The house was different from what she had expected. It wasn't just old and decrepit. It was alive. The walls seemed to breathe. The floorboards shifted beneath her feet, and the air was thick with the scent of rot and iron. Lily's flashlight flickered as she moved deeper into the house, drawn by an unseen force. She found herself in the room of mirrors, just as Emily had years before. The ornate mirror stood in the center, its surface rippling like water. Lily approached it, her reflection staring back at her with hollow eyes. But then her reflection smiled, a cruel, twisted smile that sent a jolt of terror through her. "Welcome home," the reflection said, its voice echoing in the room. Lily tried to back away, but the mirrors around her began to shift, their surfaces melting into a swirling black void. Shadows emerged from the mirrors, their forms indistinct but their intentions clear. They reached for her, their cold fingers brushing against her skin. She screamed, but no sound came out. The shadows pulled her into the mirror, and the room fell silent. The next morning, Lily was gone. Her family searched for her, and the townsfolk joined in, though they knew the truth. The house had taken her, just as it had taken so many others. But this time, something was different. That night, Mark and Linda heard knocking at their door. When they opened it, they found Lily standing there, her eyes blank and her skin pale. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at them with an empty expression. Relieved but unnerved, they brought her inside. But as the days passed, they realized that this wasn't their daughter. She didn't eat, didn't sleep, and would often stand in front of the mirror for hours, whispering to herself in a language they couldn't understand. Then, on the next Halloween, Max disappeared. He had been dared by his friends to knock on the door of the house, and like so many before him, he never returned. When Lily found out, she smiled, a cold, lifeless smile, and whispered, "The house is hungry." The house on Hollow Hill was no longer satisfied with one victim a year. It had awakened, its hunger growing with each soul it consumed. The townsfolk began to notice strange occurrences, shadows moving on their own, whispers in the wind, and reflections that didn't match their movements. The house was spreading its influence, reaching out into the town, claiming more and more victims. One by one, the people of Black Hollow began to disappear. Some were lured to the house, while others were taken in their sleep, their beds left cold and empty. The house was no longer just a legend. It was a plague, a curse that threatened to consume the entire town. In a desperate attempt to stop the house, a group of townsfolk ventured up the hill on Halloween night, armed with holy water, crosses, and whatever weapons they could find. They broke down the door and entered the house, determined to destroy it once and for all. But the house was ready for them. The walls closed in, the floors gave way, and the mirrors came alive, their surfaces twisting into grotesque faces that laughed and screamed. The group was torn apart, their bodies absorbed into the house, their souls trapped within its walls. As the last of them fell, the house let out a low, guttural groan, as if it were savoring its victory. The door slammed shut, and the house fell silent once more. But the curse was far from over. The house on Hollow Hill had tasted the souls of an entire town, and its hunger was insatiable. It would wait, patient and silent, for the next group of fools to knock on its door. And when they did, it would claim them all. The house on Hollow Hill had become a living nightmare, its influence spreading like a cancer through Black Hollow. The once thriving town was now a ghost town, its streets empty, its homes abandoned. Those who remained were too terrified to leave, trapped by the curse that had consumed their lives. The house had grown stronger with each soul it claimed, its dark energy seeping into the very earth, twisting the forest into a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. But the house was not done. It had a plan, a final, horrifying act that would ensure its power would never be challenged again. Deep within the house, in a room of mirrors, the ornate mirror began to pulse with a sickly, green light. The symbols carved into its frame glowed faintly, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. The mirror was no longer just a portal. It was a gateway, a bridge between worlds. And on the other side, something was stirring. The house had been summoning it for years, feeding it with the souls of the lost. It was an ancient entity, a being of pure darkness that had existed long before the house, long before the town, long before humanity itself. It had no name, no form, but it hungered for the world of the living. And now, it was almost freed that a small group of survivors remained in Black Hollow, determined to end the curse once and for all. Among them was Mrs. Grayson, the elderly woman who had tried to warn the newcomers, Tom, a former sheriff who had lost his family to the house, and Sarah, the younger sister of Emily, who had disappeared years before. They had spent months researching the house, uncovering its dark history and the rituals used to contain it. They learned that the house had been built by a man named Ezekiel Hollow, a madman who had dabbled in forbidden magic. He had summoned the entity, hoping to gain immortality, but it had consumed him instead. The house was his prison, his punishment, and the mirror was the key to the entity's freedom. The group knew they had to destroy the mirror, but to do so, they would have to enter the house on Halloween night, the one night when the barrier between worlds was at its weakest. Armed with ancient relics and a fragile hope, the group made their way up the hill. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the sky. The air was thick with the sound of whispers, and the ground beneath their feet felt soft, almost alive. When they reached the house, the door was already open, waiting for them. They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The house was different now. The walls were slick with a black, oily substance, and the air was filled with the sound of distant screams. They made their way to the room of mirrors, their hearts pounding in their chests. The ornate mirror stood in the center of the room, its surface rippling like water. The symbols on its frame glowed brighter as they approached, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Don't look into the mirror," Mrs. Grayson warned, her voice trembling. "It will try to take you." But it was too late. Tom, the former sheriff, had already looked. His eyes widened in horror as he saw his reflection, not as he was, but as he would become. His skin withered, his eyes turned black, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. He reached out, his hand breaking through the surface of the mirror, and before anyone could stop him, he was pulled inside. The remaining survivors knew they had to act fast. Sarah stepped forward, clutching an ancient dagger she had found in her research. She plunged it into the mirror, the blade shattering the surface with a deafening crack. The room was filled with a blinding light, and the house began to shake, its walls crumbling around them. But the entity was not so easily defeated. The mirror reformed, its surface swirling with dark energy. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the shadows in the room began to take shape, forming into grotesque, humanoid figures. Mrs. Grayson stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We have to complete the ritual," she said. "We have to seal the mirror." She began to chant, her voice echoing through the room. Sarah joined in, their voices blending together in a desperate plea for salvation. The symbols on the mirror's frame began to glow brighter, and the shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into smoke. But the entity was not done. It reached out, its tendrils of darkness wrapping around Mrs. Grayson, pulling her toward the mirror. She fought back, her voice never wavering, but it was too strong. With a final, desperate cry, she was pulled into the mirror, her body disappearing into the void. Sarah was alone now, the house crumbling around her. She knew what she had to do. She stepped forward, clutching the dagger, and plunged it into her own chest. Her blood spilled onto the mirror, the ancient symbols flaring to life with a blinding light. The entity let out a deafening roar, its form dissolving into smoke as the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The house shook violently, its walls collapsing as the dark energy that had sustained it was finally released. Sarah fell to the ground, her vision fading as the house crumbled around her. She had done it. She had ended the curse. When the dust settled, the house on Hollow Hill was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble. The forest began to heal, the twisted trees returning to their natural state. The town of Black Hollow was silent, its streets empty, its people gone. But the curse was not completely broken. The entity had been banished, but it was not destroyed. It lingered in the shadows, waiting for the next foolish soul to summon it. And somewhere, deep within the ruins of the house, a single shard of the mirror remained, its surface reflecting the faintest glimmer of light. The house on Hollow Hill was gone, but the darkness it had unleashed would never truly be vanquished. It was a reminder that some horrors are too great to be destroyed, and that the line between the living and the dead is thinner than we dare to imagine. And so, the legend of the house on Hollow Hill lives on, a dark whisper in the wind, a warning to those who dare to seek out the unknown. For the house may be gone, but the curse remains. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.